Chapter 1. Smoke in the lower halls. Karak Hollow had not died cleanly. There were dwarf holds in the World's Edge Mountains that had been smashed in glory, their gatehouses blackened by dragonfire, their kings dragged down beneath tides of greenskins, their names entered in Adama's crown, with strokes so deep the chisels bit sparks from stone. There was honor in such endings. There was fury. There was memory. Karak Hollow had not earned even that. It had dwindled. Its upper hall still lived, if such a thing could be called living. A few hundred souls clung there in soot and iron and old bitterness, huddled in chambers built for 10 times their number. Once its deeps had rung with hammers day and night. Once olives had groaned beneath silver and iron. Once the King's Road through the eastern galleries had seen caravans from Jufbar and Karak Kadrin, oxen snorting steam under lantern light. Now half the hold lay sealed behind old cave-ins, grudge walls and iron doors, with rust caked thick on their hinges. Whole districts stood abandoned in the dark like tomb cities, their hearths cold, their cisterns stale, their ancestor faces staring sightlessly from niches furred with fungus. The parts that remained habitable did so out of spite rather than strength. Smoke hung under every vaulted ceiling. The braziers were fed with grudging care. Coal was rationed, timber rarer still. The stone sweated in places, old damp seeping through cracked joints. In the market hall men and dwarfs bartered in low, angry voices over sacks of cave moss, smoked goat, lamp oil and black powder measured by the thumb and grain. The goats bleated in cramped side pens carved out of old armories. Children ran where they ought not, under the eyes of mothers too weary to beat sense into them every hour of the day. Every wall bore chips where carvings had been prized out to sell, and every face had the same hollowness. The look of folk who had spent too long pretending endurance was the same thing as hope. At the hall of the Third Forge, the clan elders argued beneath soot-black statues of kings no one living had ever served. The chamber was grand in the way dying things sometimes remained grand, stubbornly refusing to stoop to their condition. Tall ruined pillars vanished into dark above. Rust-red banners hung in strips. The great central furnace had not burned hot in 20 years, but heat still leaked from its brick heart in a tired glow that painted every beard and scar in bloody amber. "You dig or you leave," growled Brock Grunison, master of works, slamming a thick hand on the stone table. His knuckles were warped with old breaks. Black powder had chewed half an ear away years earlier. Those are the choices. Not prayers, not speeches, not another month of counting nails and pretending the silver vaults will fill themselves. Across from him, Elder Harjan Stonevein's lip curled back from yellowed teeth. His beard rings were old silver gone dark with tarnish, his one good eye bright with hate. "And where do you dig, fool?" "Into sealed galleries marked shut by our grandsires, into cracked levels where the roofs sing when the carts roll by. You want fresh ore so badly, take a pick to the mountain's teeth and see if she bites." "She already is biting," Brock snarled. "We've 2 months of powder left, 3 if we stretch. The mushroom vaults are patchy, the trade roads unsafe half the season. We pull iron out of the old lodes like picking bones from a corpse. The lower blasting galleries were sealed because there was no labor to work them, not because every shaft below is cursed." At that, several elders muttered and spat, because in an old hold, nothing was ever merely practical. Every stone had a grievance attached to it. Every sealed passage had a story, and stories grew fangs in the dark. "The old maps are rotten," said Dori Helga, keeper of stores, "thin as a nail and twice as sour. The supports in the south galleries are suspect. We breach wrong, and we may lose half the western habs." "We lose them anyway by winter, if we do nothing," said Brock. The debate rolled on like boulders in a chute, grinding the same points smooth with repetition. "Leave the hold," said some. There was no shame in survival. "Take what remained, march to a stronger Karak, swear new oaths, begin again under another lord's roof, better exile than burial." Others answered that to abandon Karak Hollow was a shame blacker than death, that their dead lay in crypts beneath those stones, that a hold was not a roadside inn to be vacated when the roof leaked. Voices rose. Tankards slammed. Old accusations resurfaced, some so ancient no one under 70 remembered the first insult. In the end, as such arguments often did, it came down to necessity and bad temper. Brock got his blasting crews. Not many. Barely enough. A score of miners, 3 powder men, 2 grudge bearers to mark any breach into sealed inheritance, and a knot of shield dwarfs in case the old dark held more than dust. They went down 5 days later into the lower south galleries, where the carved lintels bore the names of dead clans, and the air tasted of mold and old cold. Great iron seals were broken, chisel runes cracked, prayers were muttered to ancestors no one believed were listening. Then the first charges went off. The sound rolled through Karak Hollow like distant thunder under the floor of the world. Dust showered from the ceilings of the upper habs. Cups danced on shelves. Children cried. Somewhere, old mortar gave with a dry, brittle pop. In the lower tunnels the blasts punched through packed stone and ancient falls, opening new mouths into long-buried workings. Men cheered. Dwarfs grunted approval. Fresh veins were glimpsed in torchlight dark seams in the rock, promising iron, maybe copper, maybe enough silver to buy another year of breath. Then came the second round of blasting, deeper and heavier. This time, the mountain answered. A tremor ran through the hold so hard it threw folk to their knees. Cracks shot like lightning through old plaster. In the goat pens 3 beasts broke their tether posts and screamed. The sound of shifting stone came up from beneath, a deep grinding convulsion like teeth gnashing in a giant's buried skull. One of the lower access tunnels collapsed outright, choking a pair of miners under falling rubble. The men dragged them out, gasping and red-faced, alive by inches. Brock cursed and ordered the crews back. The elders shouted at one another over the aftershocks. The priests muttered that old things had been disturbed. By next morning, one of the goat pens was empty. The pen itself stood intact, which was the first wrongness. The iron latch had not been forced. The timbers had not been broken. But 4 goats were gone, and the 5th remained in the straw with its back half missing, ribs standing out wet and white through a gobbet of steaming red ruin. There was blood up the wall in a long spray. The stone floor had been scored by something that bit deep enough to peel curls from it. The stable hand who found the carcass vomited until his throat bled. "Goblins," said the captain of the gate watch immediately, because goblins were easier to name than uncertainty. Or night snatchers with them. That satisfied most for all of half a day. A pair of lads were sent to search the old goat paths above the eastern face. The watch doubled at the smaller posterns. Women brought children in off the side passages and boxed their ears for wandering. Knives were sharpened. There was comfort in the familiar shape of fear. Greenskins were understood. Greenskins stank of fungus and wet dog and old blood. They laughed too much. They left ugly little tracks, and worse, little arrows. A dwarf could hate them properly. The second disappearance cracked that comfort. The child was named Sally, 6 years old, daughter of a lamp maker. She vanished on the way back from the cistern tunnels with her brother, no more than 20 paces behind him. One moment she was there, copper jug clutched to her chest, grumbling about the cold. The next, there was only the clatter of the jug spinning on stone and the brother's shriek ricocheting through the hall. They found smears of blood on the wall at shoulder height, a few teeth, one tiny shoe caught in a crack. No one found the rest. After that, the hold changed. Panic in a dwarf hold was an ugly thing, not loud at first, but dense and poisonous, like gas building in a sealed shaft. Doors were barred, lamps burned through the sleep hours, old feud lines sharpened overnight. Humans in the hold, traders, laborers, hangers-on, who had nowhere else to go, were watched more closely, as though any outsider might secretly be in league with the dark. Even among the dwarfs, suspicion spread. Who had pushed for the blasting? Who had voted against it? Which elder had known the maps were wrong? Every answer bred another accusation. The third killing ended all pretense that matters were under control. Barak Fen, watch dwarf of the lower west turn, failed to report at dawn. He was a veteran of 40 years tunnel duty, broad-backed, steady, and too mean to die easily. 3 others went to fetch him and came back white-faced beneath their beards. What was left of Barak lay 50 yards from his post, in a side gallery no wider than a cart axle. His helmet had been flattened onto his skull, as if struck by a millstone. One arm was gone from the shoulder. His mail had been peeled open. His ribs had been torn outward, not cut, and the cavity beneath was a butcher's trough of ruined organs and clotting black blood. There were finger gouges in the stone where he had tried to drag himself away. The tracks of his heels ran for 6 feet through his own guts. He had not died quickly. There was no sign of goblin arrows, no mushrooms, no camp, no stink of wolf riders. Only the wreckage of a lantern, blood smeared low across the wall, and a drag mark vanishing into a crack in the rock too narrow for any man, dwarf, or goblin to squeeze through. That was when they sent for the hunter. His name was Garrick Voss, though some in the hold called him Grey Garrick for the ash-colored streaks in his beard and the dust that never seemed to leave his coat. He was not a dwarf. That earned him little affection before he ever opened his mouth. He came up from the lower gate in a patched leather long coat, with a crossbow on his back, a hatchet at his belt, and the face of a man who had learned long ago that pity was a luxury mostly enjoyed by the dead. One cheek was a ladder of scar tissue. 2 fingers on his left hand were missing. His eyes were pale and flat, the color of winter puddles. He had hunted beastmen in the foothills, ghouls in old cairns, smugglers in culverts beneath Nuln, and once so he claimed something eyeless and white in a flooded silver mine near Karak Asgal. Most of that was likely lies, or half-lies. Men in his trade padded truth the way soldiers padded kill counts. What mattered was that he knew tunnels, he knew spoor, and he owed Karak Hollow money. That last point, more than any reputation, was why he agreed. They found him in the tap room of the Broken Pick, bent over cheap spirits and a slate of tally marks he had no means of clearing. When the steward of the hold named the bounty, Karak snorted and asked whether they wanted the goblins skinned or merely counted. He expected greenskins. Everybody expected greenskins. It was a dirty little job in a dying hold. Find the nest, kill a few sneaks, collect coin, leave before the mountain finished settling onto their heads. He took the work because debt was a noose, and this one at least came with a weapon in hand. By dusk he was in the lower halls with a hooded lamp, a short spear, and 2 shield dwarfs assigned to him more as watchers than companions. One was called Olin, who resented humans on principle. The other was Nessa, scarred across the chin and practical enough to let competence do the talking. Neither had much to say as they showed him the goat pen, the cistern passage, and Barik's last post. Karak crouched long over the blood and damage. He prodded the scored floor with the butt of his spear. He sniffed the air at the crack where Barik's remains had been dragged. He examined the stone around it, with a lamp held close, turning his head slowly. "Well?" Olin asked at last, voice thick with contempt and unease. Karak rubbed a clot of blood between finger and thumb. "Not goblins," Olin bristled. "And how in the deeps would you know that so quick? No spoor, no scrapings from iron-shod boots, no piss-stink nest nearby, no greasy handprints, no dropped gut bones, no arrowheads. Goblins are filthy little bastards. They leave themselves all over a place." He tapped the cracked wall. "This is cleaner. Worse, too." Nessa frowned. "Worse how?" He pointed to the stone peeled up beside the drag mark. "Wait, something heavy enough to crush a helm flat with one strike." Then he angled the lamp at the fissure. "And strength. See that edge? Not pickwork, not weather. Fresh break, but worn already. Something's been passing through there. Often." Olin stared at the gap and swore under his breath. It was scarcely wider than a man's chest. "That doesn't fit," he said. Karak's mouth twitched without humor. "No, it doesn't. They followed the signs deeper." Past Barik's post, the older tunnel sloped down into parts of Karak Hollow that still remembered prosperity. Storerooms lined with empty niches, old barracks with moldering bed frames, a counting chamber whose ledger shelves lay spilled across the floor like broken ribs. Dust lay thick on most surfaces, but here and there it was disturbed not by boots, but by broad sweeps and troughs, as though sacks of wet grain had been hauled across the stone. No goblin laughter, no muttering, no telltale clink of stolen metal, only silence, and from time to time a sound so faint, Karak almost mistook it for the mountain settling. A distant scrape, then another, far below or far behind, impossible to place. Stone against stone, something moving where nothing should move. At an old junction shrine they found more blood. This one had dried to black lacquer across the floor. A dwarf ancestor's carved face had been smashed in, nose and brow knocked away in a single brutal impact. On the wall behind the altar, 3 gouges ran chest-high through solid granite. Karak laid his hand beside one. The groove was wider than 2 fingers. He looked at Nessa. "You've had cave bears in these ranges?" "In the higher valleys sometimes. Not in tunnels this tight. Not climbing through rock." They went on, slower now. The lamp flame guttered strangely in certain passages, tugged sideways by breaths of colder air. Once Olin nearly put his foot through a patch of dust-covered fracture where the floor had thinned over emptiness. Once Nessa stopped dead and raised her axe at a sound overhead, but it was only a shower of grit pattering from a ceiling seam. At the foot of a collapsed stair, Karak knelt again. There, in the powdery stone, was a mark at last that almost resembled a print. Not a boot, not a paw. Something hooked and curved, driven deep, with drag lines behind it where weight had shifted. Beside it the floor was crazed with hairline cracks. He felt a sourness rise in his gut that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with understanding that the work had changed shape. This was no nest of tunnel thieves. Whatever lived down here was old, strong, and wrong enough that the hole's map-makers had either never known of it or chosen not to record it. Ahead lay a chamber half buried under fallen stone. Once it had been a shrine, that much was plain even in ruin. Broken ancestor statues stood in alcoves, their heads shorn off by collapse. A toppled incense brazier lay split like a cracked bell. The floor was buckled. One side of the chamber had caved in long ago beneath an avalanche of rock from above, sealing whatever passage had once continued beyond. Nessa lifted her lamp. "This was shut before my father's time." Karak did not answer. Something in the chamber drew the eye at once. Not the old collapse, but the wound in the floor before it. The central flagstones had been broken upward, not cracked by settling, not shattered by a blast from the side wall. Broken upward, as though something beneath them had thrust with enormous force until stone split and bent. Jagged slabs leaned outward around a black rent, perhaps 4 feet across, the edges whitened with fresh fractures. Dust still powdered them. Chisel marks from the old masons ended cleanly where the break began. Around the hole the floor was smeared dark. Karak stepped closer. Blood, some old, brown-black and tacky in seams, some fresher, still sticky where it had pooled in hollows. Tangled beside the rupture lay a child's toy, a little carved ram on wheels. One wheel snapped off, its painted face half obscured beneath a swipe of red. Cold air breathed up from the dark below. It touched Karak's face like the exhale of a grave. He crouched at the edge and lowered the lamp. The light fell a few yards onto splintered stone, then vanished into a throat of descending black. The shaft did not look mined. Its sides were rough, curved, and scored, disappearing into the mountain at an angle too steep and too smooth for any natural crack he had ever trusted. Something had forced a way through there from the deep. Below, for one heartbeat, he heard it again, scraping, then a wet sound, like meat dragged over rock. Olin made a sign against ill luck. Nessa said nothing at all. Karak stared into the dark, at the blood-smeared toy, at the floor clawed open from beneath, and felt the sure, easy shape of a goblin hunt die inside him. Whatever had come into Karak Hollow, it had not crept in through forgotten goat paths. The mountain itself had opened its mouth and let it up. Chapter 2. The Thing Beneath Karak Hollow. By the time Karak Voss came back up from the broken shrine chamber, Karak Hollow already felt different. The hold had always been a place of grudging noise, distant hammers, cartwheels, forge bellows coughing in tired lungs, quarrels ricocheting along stone, babies crying, goats bleating, drunkards singing old marching songs in cracked voices that made the dead sound nearer than the living. Now all of that had thinned. The sound had gone wary. Folk spoke too softly. Doors shut sooner. Even the smoke in the upper hall seemed to hang more still, as if the stale air itself were listening. Word had spread ahead of him, not truth, but the greasy little shape fear took when it passed from mouth to mouth. Some said greenskins had tunneled up from beneath the roots of the mountains. Some swore it was a troll with stone-eating jaws. One old woman claimed the blasting had broken a tomb vault and loosed an ancestor's wrath. By the time Karak reached the hall of the third forge, children were being dragged indoors by the arm, and every man with enough sense to own a weapon had it close to hand. He said, as little as possible. That suited the dwarfs. They distrusted speech when silence could do the work of dread more efficiently. Brock Gronisson, master of works, listened to the report with his thick jaw working like a millstone. Nessa stood beside Karak and filled in what he left out. Olin, who had marked him at the start, did not meet his eye once. When Karak described the chamber open from below, the blood, the toy, the shaft slanting into blackness, the engineer's face hardened into something cold and inward-looking. "No goblin does that," Karak said at last. "No," said Brock. "Have your maps got anything under that shrine?" Brock grunted, then beckoned to a slate table under the furnace light. Soot-blackened vellum had been spread over it, corners pinned by iron weights. The maps were old, layered with repairs and bitter little annotations in several hands. Whole districts had been crossed through. Some passages ended in neat lines where later collapses had erased them from use. Others were marked with old runes of warning and black circles where cisterns or buried vaults were thought to lie. Brock stabbed a square finger at the lower shrine levels. There should be bedrock under that chamber. Old support shelves. No galleries. No shafts. There are now. The engineer's nostrils flared. Aye, Elder Hagen wanted the entire south lower quarter sealed by nightfall. Dori Helgar demanded every human in the hold be searched for signs of conspiracy. Another elder muttered about curses and recommended sacrifice, though whether of powder or people was not made clear. The shouting rose quickly, not because anyone had answers, but because dwarfs preferred anger to helplessness, and the hall had become thick with both. Brock cut through it with a roar. "Enough!" He straightened over the table, broad as an anvil, and nearly as scarred, powder burn marks stippling one cheek and one forearm. "We don't collapse blind. We don't panic blind. We look, we mark, we learn what in the deeps is under us before some witless bastard blows the wrong charge and buries us all." It was decided, with all the grace of a fist fight. Karak would go back down. Brock himself would lead the survey. Nessa insisted on joining and was permitted because she had seen the breach with her own eyes and was less likely than most to turn stupid in the dark. Along with them came Rurik Dane, a young warrior from one of the old clan lines, whose beard was still too short to braid properly, and whose confidence had not yet been beaten into anything like sense. He had petitioned for the descent with such noisy certainty that several elders allowed it simply to stop hearing him. The fifth was Hilda Marsdottir, a grim-faced matriarch from the West Habs whose grandson had vanished near the cistern tunnels, and whose silence carried more weight than the opinions of lesser folk. She did not ask permission. She came with a cleaver-bladed axe and a miner's lamp, and anyone who might have objected found they did not wish to do so within reach of her eyes. They descended before dawn. The lower hall swallowed light greedily. What little warmth the upper levels retained died by degrees as they moved through old arches and storage caverns and the dead neighborhoods of the hold. Their boots rang on worked stone where the ancient masons had left smooth flagging, then crunched over fallen grit where the mountain had begun reclaiming its own. Lamps painted the carved walls in blunt, yellow smears. Long ancestor friezes marched along the galleries, rows of stern dwarf faces looking down through soot and cracked noses, their names half lost under centuries of grime. Karak walked in front with spear and lamp, his crossbow slung over one shoulder. Brock followed with a satchel of chalk, pegs, measuring chain, and folded copies of the old plans. Nessa kept the rear. Rurik prowled between, trying too hard not to seem eager. Hilda walked as if she meant to drag the answer out of the stone itself and throttle it. The old workings had an oppressive grandeur that living halls no longer possessed. The ceilings rose higher. Pillars were thicker, carved with runes no modern mason in Karak Hollow had time to cut. Vault doors, their bronze gone green and rough, stood sealed along the way with ancestor marks hammered onto them. Some had old battle damage on their frames. Others showed fresher signs, scratches in the patina, dust disturbed around the thresholds, chips in the mortar where something had tested the stone and moved on. At one junction, Karak paused by a wall covered in old grudges. Thousands of names and wrongs had been chiseled there over generations in rows so dense the surface resembled scales. Gold unpaid, oaths broken, kin left unavenged, spoiled trade, lost banners, collapses blamed on rival foremen long turned to powder in their crypts. Several lines near the bottom had split where a crack ran through the wall from floor to ceiling. Fresh stone showed pale through the ancient script, and along the crack itself there were marks like someone had forced hooked blades into the seam and widened it. Rurik leaned in, brow furrowing. "Goblin tools?" "Too deep," Karak said. Hilda rested a calloused hand on one of the names cut into the stone. Mar's daughter, old and nearly worn smooth. Her mouth tightened. This crack wasn't here last winter. Brock made a mark on his slate and moved on. They passed chambers with signs that made the air sit poorly in the lungs. A collapsed ore store with a hole chewed through the rear wall, not blasted, not mined, but bored through broken stone and scree at a slant too irregular for craftsmen. An abandoned sleeping barracks where the floor had heaved in ridges, as though something huge had pushed just under the flagging before settling deeper again. A cistern hole with stagnant black water and a smear of old blood high on one pillar, dried in thin fingers where someone had braced a hand while being dragged away. Everywhere there was the same pattern. The recent blasting had cracked old seams and opened roots, but in places beyond the new damage, deeper in forgotten quarters, there were older breaches too. Long-healed fractures, ancient repairs, sealed side passages with doubled masonry, chisel runes of warning worked into lintels and then plastered over later, as if some ancestor had wanted both to remember and to hide. At the threshold of a buried archive chamber, Brock halted sharply. A stone fall had half-blocked the entry generations ago, but there was still room to squeeze through. Inside, rows of low record shelves lay under furred dust. Bronze tube cases had gone green. A toppled lectern lay split in two. The air smelled of paper rot and old oil. "Help me," Brock muttered. The engineer and Nessa shifted enough broken stone to clear a path to the back wall. There, under a crust of grime, a panel of old carved relief emerged. Dwarfs, in ancient scale mail, hacking at something serpent-thick and many-limbed amid collapsing galleries. The work was crude with age and weathering, but the fear in it remained readable even after centuries. One figure was shown being dragged bodily into shattered rock. Another thrust a flaming charge into a fissure. Above them all loomed a thing without eyes, all plated curves and ringed maw, like a worm crossed with a crab and made hateful by stone. Rurik laughed once, too loud and false. "Some ancestor's fable." "No," said Brock, quietly. He scraped away more dirt from the runes beneath the relief. The old script was cramped and archaic, but he could still sound it out. His voice dropped as he translated, each word roughened by the dust in his throat. "Dot, in the reign of Thane Orsic Hollowbrow, when the south deeps were first cut for iron, workers broke into the hunger below. He swallowed and continued. Not demon, not greenskin, not beast of surface kind, but burrower from the black roots, blind to lamp and sun, drawn by pounding and powder, eater of flesh and stone fungus alike. Many lost in the lower veins. The chamber had become very quiet. Even Rurik's bravado had no place to stand. Brock traced further down the inscription. It could not be slain in the deep fracture, for each collapse birthed new ways for it and slew our own. Thus the galleries were broken above it, the roots smothered, and the names of those ways stricken from all common maps. Let no son of the hold seek silver there again. Hilda's jaw clenched hard enough to show muscle in her cheeks. They knew, Brock said, and hid it. Then my grandson died because dead fools wanted ore. No one answered her. There was no answer fit to survive the sound of her voice. They took what records they could. A cracked slate etched with old support roots. A brass tube containing mold-stiffened survey sheets. Another relief in a side alcove showing 3 collapsed levels, deliberately filled with rubble and sealed under ancestor marks. Garrick read little, but he understood enough. Whatever haunted Karak Hollow was old. Not an intruder newly come. A remnant. A thing once entombed and forgotten, now stirred awake by blasting charges and the arrogance of the desperate. They found further proof in the old deeps. Past the archive, the tunnels narrowed and sloped through, worked stone into rougher cuts, where the old miners had followed some promising vein and then abandoned it. The walls here were cracked and veined with pale mineral seams. In places the roof had slumped low enough that even dwarfs had to bend. The air grew colder, not fresher. There was no scent of the world above, but sharply cold, as if it were being pulled up from some deeper subterranean emptiness that had never known a season. Garrick smelled it before he heard it. A rank mineral musk, not like goblins or wolves or any beast of the open. It had the stink of wet stone split open, of old meat, of caves sealed so long that the rot inside had gone strange and thin. He raised a fist. The others halted. Lamps shivered in the close air. Then came the sound. Scrape. Pause. Scrape. Scrape. Not from a head alone. Not from any one direction a sane mind could like. It seemed to travel through the walls themselves, filtered and carried along cracks, now near enough to tighten the spine, now distant enough to seem imagined. Rurik grinned with the brittle excitement of youth, and gripped his axe haft harder. "Let it come," Brock muttered. "Idiot." They moved on in tighter order. Garrick's eyes roved over floor, wall, roof, searching for shape or motion. Twice he thought he saw something pale vanish through a seam in the fractured stone. Only a flick, a curve, a suggestion of armor plating retreating where no creature that size ought to fit. The tunnel floor bore more of the hooked impressions he had seen before, deep and irregular, with scree pushed aside in furrows. Once there was a smear of fresh slime on the wall, translucent and milky, dust clinging to it. Then they entered a support passage where the roof had partly dropped and everything happened at once. The tunnel was too narrow for comfort, old braces wedged along one side, a crawl space of splintered beams and shattered stone pinching the way. Karak had just stepped over a broken prop when the wall to Rurik's right exploded inward. Not cracked, exploded. Stone burst across the passage in a shotgun blast of shards. Dust and grit filled the lamp glow. Something pale and plated came through with obscene speed, as if the mountain had spat out a butcher's nightmare. Karak saw it in pieces, because the whole of it was too wrong to take in at first glance. A crescent of slick ivory armor, ridged like overlapping shields, a mouth at the front, not hinged like a beast's jaw but ringed, opening in layers, lined with rasping teeth that worked in circles like a lamprey made large enough to swallow a man's head. Limbs too many, jointed backward and inward, each ending in hooked claws made for anchoring in stone. No eyes, no face fit for pity or hatred. Only appetite, shaped for the dark. It hit Rurik before the youth could even shout. One hooked limb punched through mail and under his arm with a wet metallic crunch. Another clamped around his thigh. The beast folded him sideways against the wall so hard his shoulder burst from the socket with a sound like a green branch snapping. His axe flew from his hand. He screamed then, a raw, astonished sound, and the thing's maw struck his chest. The ring of teeth did not bite like any wolf or man. It latched and burrowed. Mail split. Flesh opened in a circular spray. Karak saw skin peel inward, ribs grind and cave under the grinding pressure, and then blood came out in a steaming arterial wash so hot it spattered his face and lamp hand. Rurik's scream chopped off into bubbling gargles as the creature tore a gobbet of him free big as a butchered haunch. Strike! Bok roar. Nessa was already moving. Her axe slammed into one pale limb with enough force to chip sparks. The blow bit, cracking plate, and spilling grey-white slurry beneath. But the limb did not come off. Hilda buried her cleaver into another joint, and the beast convulsed, dragging Rurik's convulsing body half out of the tunnel wall. Karak drove his spear two-handed at the place he guessed a throat might be. The spearhead punched into the ringed maw just as it opened again. The sensation went up the shaft into his arms, a slick resistance, then a horrible tearing give, as though he had rammed through layers of muscle arranged wrong. The creature spasmed violently. The spear snapped at midshaft. Karak was nearly yanked forward into the teeth. He threw himself back, ripping the broken end free in a wash of blood and foul whitish fluid. For one heartbeat the beast's front half was clear in the lamplight. Its plates were not truly white, but the color of things never touched by sun, blotched with mineral stains and old scars. Dust clung to its slime-slick joints. The innermost circle of its mouth was packed with smaller teeth, still working mechanically, even as black-red blood pumped out around Karak's broken spearhead. Behind the forelimbs, the body thickened and vanished back through the shattered wall into packed rubble, as if the mountain held a second tunnel just wide enough for its monstrous bulk to swim through. It shrieked, then not a roar, but a grinding metallic scream that set teeth on edge and shook more dust from the roof. Rurik was still alive. He should not have been. His chest was a crater of torn mail, pulped meat, and jutting bone. One lung hissed pink foam. His left arm hung by strips. He looked down once at himself with a child's naked incomprehension, as though his body had become someone else's ruin. Then the beast yanked. His leg came off at the hip. The force of it slapped Garrick with warm blood and strings of tissue. Rurik's torso struck the floor and thrashed, heels drumming, fingers clawing at nothing. His mouth worked soundlessly. The tunnel stank of opened guts, lamp oil, and the beast's mineral carrion musk. Hilda hacked at it with a sound that was not quite human. Brock fired a pistol point blank into the side of its plated head. The shot boomed in the confined passage like a cannon. Smoke swallowed everything for an instant. When it thinned, the ball had gouged a crater in the creature's armor and splashed grey matter and black blood across the wall. Still it did not die. It released what remained of Rurik and withdrew with appalling speed, folding backward through the rubble and broken stone, not retreating in panic, but flowing into the wall the way an eel slips into silt. One hooked limb lashed out as it vanished and caught Nessa across the side. Her mail tore. Flesh opened from ribs to hip in a red flap. She staggered, slammed into a beam, and stayed upright by pure malice. Then the passage was empty, except for dust, blood, and the twitching pieces of a young warrior cooling on the stones. For several seconds no one moved. Rurik's head had struck the floor at a wrong angle. One eye stared. His lips still trembled around words that would never form. Blood ran in narrow streams down the slight slope of the tunnel, carrying fragments of him with it. Garrick forced air into his lungs and listened. Nothing, no second charge, no scrape nearby. It was gone, or farther back in the walls, circling beyond sight. "Wrap her," he snapped, nodding to Nessa. Brock was already at work, tearing cloth from his own undershirt and binding the wound hard while she bit down on a leather strap and trembled with rage rather than fear. Hilda stood over what remained of Rurik and looked at the broken body with a face carved from old grief. "We leave him?" she asked. No one wanted to say yes. Brock finally did. "We carry what we can, not all." So they took his helm, his axe, and the upper half of him wrapped in a torn cloak. The leg and the rest were left where they had fallen because the tunnel was too narrow, the danger too close, and death in the dark had little use for ceremony. The walk back up was worse than the descent. Every crack in the wall seemed ready to give birth to pale hooked limbs. Every groan of settling stone sounded like the thing returning. Nessa bled through her bindings and said not a word. Hilda carried Rurik's axe as if it were something she meant to return personally to whatever gods had allowed boys to die for old men's mistakes. Garrick kept turning his head at the faintest scrape, seeing in memory the lamprey maw opening in petals of teeth, the circular wound it had gnawed through mail and breastbone, the way it had moved through the mountain, as if rock were merely another form of water. When they reached the upper halls with blood on them and less company than they had taken down, Karak Hollow read the truth before anyone spoke it aloud. The arguments began before the dead were even properly laid out. "Collapse the lower halls," some shouted. "Bury the thing. Seal every breach with powder and stone and prayers enough to satisfy any ancestor still listening. Better lose the deeps than the children." Others answered that the hold could not survive such blind destruction. Brock, grey with dust and fury, spread the recovered maps across the soot-blackened table, and barked for silence until his voice cracked. He took a charred stick and began marking what they had found. The shrine breach, the old archive warnings, the fresh tunnel attack, the older sealed fractures hidden beneath repaired masonry. As he drew, a pattern emerged, ugly and unmistakable. The beast's burrows did not run in a neat layer below the hold. They webbed through it, under old support shelves, around sealed cisterns, beneath abandoned habs that now served as load-bearing deadweight for the inhabited quarters above. In places, the voids it had opened and enlarged had become part of what held other masses of unstable stone in uneasy balance. "If we drop this quarter," Brock said, jabbing one square of the map, "the shock may take the west habs with it." Murmur. "If we seal here," another jab, "we force pressure sideways into cracked supports beneath the market hall." More murmur, paler face. "And if you kill it in one of these vault chambers," he went on, voice low now, and somehow worse for that, "its own collapse may clog a burrow that is carrying half the mountain's weight around a deadfall from 2 centuries back. There are tunnels under us that should not exist, and voids being held open by chance, by rubble, and by the path that thing has made. We are not looking at a beast in a mine. We are looking at rot inside a bone." No one shouted after that. The truth did the work more cleanly. Garrick stared at the map and felt the hunt curdle into something else, something meaner and more hopeless. A goblin nest could be burned. A troll could be trapped. Even a cave bear could be baited and brought down. But this creature had become braided into the failing body of Karak Hollow itself. Its passages undercut the hold's last habitable halls. Its movement had opened vents and pressure routes the mountain now depended on in ugly, temporary ways. Destroying it might save lives. Destroying it might also bring the roofs down on everyone still sleeping above. Brock laid the charred stick aside. Across the soot-blackened vellum, the lines of the beast's tunnels spread beneath the final livable holes of Karak Hollow like veins under a failing heart. Chapter 3. A Hunt Through Ruin. Karak Hollow did not break all at once. It sagged. It sagged in the hours after Brock Runnison spread the soot-blackened maps on the forge table and showed the hold what was beneath its feet. Fear thickened the air until even the braziers seemed to burn poorly. Men drank too hard and too early. Women sharpened kitchen knives on door lintels until sparks jumped. Old grudges, which had always lain in Karak Hollow like embers in ash, found fresh breath and glowed hot again. Every corridor became a place where voices stopped when strangers approached. Every meal was eaten with one ear turned toward the floor. The hold was still alive, but it had begun to listen to its own grave. The arguments in the hall of the third forge turned meaner than before. Hog in stone vein demanded the lower halls be sealed and cursed the fools who had broken the old wards. Dori Helga, thin and bitter as rust, accused Brock outright of dooming the hold for the sake of one more year of awe. Brock returned the accusation by reminding Dori that she had voted for the blasting once the ledgers turned ugly enough. Human traders, who had lived in Karak Hollow under sufferance for years, were suddenly looked at as if they were vermin fattened in the walls. 2 miners came to blows in the market passage over a sack of coal, and one ended the dispute with his ear half torn off and 3 teeth spit wetly into the dust. Garrick Voss watched it all with the tired contempt of a man who had seen doomed places before. Fear never made people wiser. It only made them simpler. Some wanted to bury the beast under half a mountain and damn the cost. Some wanted to leave Karak Hollow that very night and march into the snow with whatever they could carry. Some wanted a culprit they could actually put hands on, and so they reached for the nearest neighbor, the nearest old debt, the nearest insult not yet avenged. He was in the broken pick when the next attack came. It was not late lamp hour rather than deep night, but the drinking den was already crowded, packed with folk too frightened to sit alone, tankards knocked together with brittle cheer. Smoke pooled beneath the beams. Garik had a cup of dwarf spirits in front of him, and no appetite for it. Nessa sat opposite, her side bound tight beneath her mail shirt, her face waxy with pain but stubbornly upright. Brock had not come. He was buried in cracked plans and support calculations, trying to map a madness that shifted every time the mountain settled. The screaming began somewhere above the tap room, not the ordinary cry of drunks, nor the sharp quarrel bark of market trouble. This was full-throated terror, shrill enough to stop every voice in the room dead. A heartbeat later came a crash from the level above, the splintering blow of timber giving way, then another scream that cut off wetly. Garik was moving before the cup stopped rolling. He hit the stair, with crossbow in hand, Nessa on his heels, half the tap room surging behind them with whatever weapons they had brought close. The upper corridor was a chaos of smoke and panicked bodies. One of the floor grates near the old laundry chambers had burst upward in twisted iron. Stone slabs around it were cracked and tilted. Steam hissed through the jagged gaps. Blood slicked the flags. A woman lay half in, half out of the rupture. Her lower body was gone below the hips. Her hands still clawed at the floor, as if she might pull herself away from what had eaten her. A child was jammed against the wall nearby under fallen shelving, alive only because terror had frozen him silent. Beyond them, the laundry room itself had been torn open. One whole side of it had caved into a black cavity below, as though some giant unseen shovel had scooped the foundations out from underneath. And in that cavity something moved. Garik saw only fragments through smoke and drifting plaster. A pale arch of plated back, hooked limbs braced in broken stone, the wet, grinding pulse of that circular maw, worrying at something in the dark. He fired by instinct. The bolt vanished into the rubble. The thing convulsed. A scream, like rusted iron, dragged across granite, blasted out of the hole. Dust exploded upward. The child began to wail. Then the beast surged higher. For one savage instant it hauled itself half into the laundry chamber, and everyone there saw enough to poison their sleep forever. It was bigger than Garik had guessed in the tunnel below. Much bigger. The forward body alone was the size of a cart horse, thick as a battering ram, and sheathed in overlapping plates the color of old bone, all scored and mud-streaked with rock dust. It had no eyes, no ears, no features fit for any earthly beast, only smooth armor tapering toward that obscene lamprey maw, ringed in grinding black teeth, and the cluster of fleshy pits beneath the jawline that opened and closed like tasting wounds. Its limbs, 6 forward that he could see, perhaps more behind, were too many and too jointed, each one tipped with hooked claws that punched into stone and held as if it were rotten wood. A butcher's apprentice, drunk enough to be slow, charged at it with a meat cleaver. The beast took him by the head. One hooked limb snapped forward so fast it blurred, punched through cheek and skull, and lifted him bodily off his feet. His face burst on the claw like overripe fruit. Teeth flew. One eye popped loose and slapped wetly against his own shoulder as the thing shook him once and hurled the corpse into the wall hard enough to leave him folded backward around a cracked support pillar. Then it dropped back into the breach and vanished in a shower of stone. By the time the fighters reached the hole, it was gone, leaving only broken flooring, a sucking dark, and the raw proof that nowhere in Karak Hollow was far enough above the deeps to be safe. Panic rippled through the hold like a disease. Families abandoned their quarters and clustered in the market hall and main forge, preferring to sleep shoulder to shoulder under guard rather than die alone behind a bolted door. The elders shouted for order and got fury instead. Men demanded weapons. Women demanded answers. Several younger dwarfs swore they would go down at once and burn the thing out with powder, maps or no maps. Others dragged them back by the beard and called them murderers. Old clan tensions sharpened into open blame. The Stone Veins accused Brock's mining crews. The Grunisons spat back. That fear had turned the elders cowardly before the beast ever came. Karak stood in the middle of the noise and realized that the monster had already begun killing Karak Hollow in ways claws and teeth alone never could. Every attack widened the cracks between the living. Every night it remained below them. The hold would tear itself thinner. So he did what desperate men sometimes did when surrounded by fools and doom. He proposed a worse idea. "We don't wait for it to choose where it feeds," he said in the hole of the third forge, loud enough to cut through the uproar. "We choose where it dies." That bought him silence, which in Karak Hollow was close enough to permission that he continued. He laid a hand on Brock's soot-marked map. "You said there are old mining districts below the south and east shelves, bigger chambers, dead haul roads, furnace vents, and abandoned lifts." Brock glared at him. "Aye, then we bait it down there, away from the Habs, through ground already fit for ruin. Trap it in a place where the fall kills it, without bringing half the hold on our heads." "Trap it," Harjan sneered. "And what do you suggest for bait, human? Your own flesh? If that works," Karak said, not even looking at him. "Or yours." A few ugly smiles twitched and died. Brock folded his arms. "You speak like a hunter, not an engineer. The old south districts are rotten. Supports are gone in places. Vent shafts have collapsed. The haul lines are seized. You start a chase down there, and you may shake loose half the mountain. And if we don't," Karak snapped, "it keeps coming up wherever it likes. Laundry chambers today, nursery level tomorrow. You want to measure the load-bearing quality of children's bones while you argue?" Brock's face darkened. "And you want to charge blind because a beast offends your trade? It offends my trade by killing people. It offends mine by turning the hold into a corpse before it's done breathing." For a moment it looked as though the two men might come across the table at each other. Then Hilda Marsdottir spoke from near the furnace, where she had stood silent through most of the shouting with her grandson's axe leaned against one shoulder. "Enough. One of you wants to save the people. One of you wants to save the stone. Do the hard thing and admit neither can be kept whole." No one replied to that, because there was nothing in it to strike at but truth. At last, Brock exhaled through his nose and jabbed 3 thick fingers at the map. "There is one place. The old Black Vein district below the east shelves. Deep hall chambers, furnace mouths, a chain lift over a spoil chasm. It was abandoned, before my father's beard came in. Too unstable to reopen, too costly to fill. If we can draw it there, we may use the old venting fires and what powder remains to hurt it. To kill it, Karak said. To hurt it enough to drive it where we need it, Brock corrected. Or to kill it if the mountain gives us leave. Not before. So the plan was born in bitterness and necessity, as most things were in Karak Hollow by then. They moved before second lamp hour with a picked party of those either hard enough, foolish enough, or bereaved enough to volunteer. Karak led. Brock came because no one else knew the old workings well enough. Nessa insisted despite the stitch of pain that pulled her mouth crooked with every deep breath. Hilda came again, grim as a funeral stone. With them were 4 miners, carrying coiled chain, wedge hammers, powder satchels, and iron lantern cages. 2 shield dwarfs with heavy axes, and old Torv, a furnace keeper, whose hands shook until they touched valves or flues, and then steadied as though the metal itself remembered him. They went by forbidden ways. The passages below the mapped lower halls had not seen regular traffic in decades, and it showed in every miserable yard. Ceilings sagged low over old support braces gone black with rot. Whole galleries had slumped sideways, where one wall had shifted under pressure over the years. In places the floor was carpeted, with shattered stone crusted in a pale fungus that crackled under boots. In others, ancient machinery hunched in the dark under curtains of dust, ore lifts locked solid with rust, rail points seized in place, pumps gone to useless skeletons of iron and timber. The dead grandeur of deeper Karak Hollow was worse here because it had no audience left. Cracked ancestor statues leaned drunkenly in alcoves, their hammer hands broken away. Vault doors sat sealed under runes no one living could quite read. Once they passed a row of niche tombs with the fronts smashed in, not by looters from outside but by collapse from within. The bones inside had spilled out and lay mixed with rubble like kindling from old white wood. Along the walls, old warnings resurfaced, chisel marks, sealed side passages, grudges cut against foremen who had hidden dangerous faults to meet quotas. One half-fallen stone board still held a tally of fatalities from some long-ago cave-in, the numbers chiseled and recut so many times the final sum was unreadable. The deeper they went, the more obvious the greater tragedy became. Karak Hollow had not merely been unlucky, it had been dying for years, decades, and everyone with authority had known it. The silver had thinned, the supports had aged, trade had dwindled. Whole districts had been shut not from isolated disasters, but because the hold had lacked the labor, the metal, the powder, or the will to save them. One crack at a time, one sealed gallery at a time, one compromise at a time. The beast was not the cause of ruin. It was the thing that had burst through the plaster and shown the rot beneath. Hilda paused at an old family quarter where dust-veiled toys lay in one corner and a stone cradle sat split under fallen debris. My mother was born in this district," she said. "They closed it before I came of age. Said the cisterns had soured. Said the supports were expensive." She looked at the cracked ceiling. Every year they said the hold would recover. Every year they found another reason to wait. Brock did not answer. His silence said enough. At the first of the furnace vents, Torv set to work with a reverence almost religious. The old mechanism was a wheel of iron thick as a millstone, green with age and half fused in place by soot and neglect. He spat on his palms and heaved. 2 miners joined him. Metal screamed. Rust flaked down in thick red showers. At last the valve shifted, belching out a breath of deep heat and ash stink from some old buried furnace line still sleeping below. "Not dead after all," Torv muttered. They opened 3 such vents along the route to the Black Vein district, enough to turn certain corridors into killing throats of heat if the beast could be driven through them. At 2 points, Brock had the miners dig old blasting alcoves free and pack them with fresh powder, not enough to bring down whole levels, but enough, he hoped, to stagger or turn the creature. Karak watched and said nothing until the 3rd charge was set. "You're being careful," he said. "I'm being alive," Brock answered. "There's a difference." Karak looked at the engineer sidelong. "You think I don't understand collapse? I think you understand dead things, not dying places. That almost started it again, the old argument sharpened by exhaustion and dread." Karak took a step closer, voice low. "I understand this. Every hour that beast lives, it feeds. It comes higher. It learns our roots. It grows bolder." Brock's broad face set like cooling iron. "And I understand this. A hero with too much powder is only a murderer who expects gratitude." Nessa cut in before either could go further. "Save the quarrel for after. If we live, you can try to strangle each other in comfort." They pushed on. The Black Vein district opened before them at last, like the ribs of a giant carcass. A vast excavation chamber yawned over a spoil chasm, so deep their lamplight did not touch bottom. Gantries of timber and iron jutted over the drop, some broken, some hanging at angles by chain and stubbornness. Old mine carts sat derailed along tracks that vanished into darkness. Chain hoists descended from the roof in clusters, their links thick as wrists and black with old grease. On the far side, furnace mouths gaped red-black and cold, with brick vent tunnels running above and behind them like arteries in a buried machine. Everywhere stood supports, pillars, braces, arches, too many and not enough. Some were ancient and broad, carved from the mountain itself. Others were later additions, ugly and hasty, timber crutches shoved under failing weight. Cracks crossed several in white spider lines. Dust hung thick in the still air. The whole district felt suspended, not by engineering but by a pact with gravity that had gone sour. Brock stared upward, reading loads in the stone the way a priest read scripture. This place shouldn't still be standing. "And yet it is," Karak said. "For now." They set the trap with the urgency of men dressing a wound while the patient bleeds out under their hands. Lanterns were hooded and placed to create lanes of light. Chains were lowered and hooked to old cart brakes that could, with luck, send a string of ore wagons careening down a side track as moving obstacles. Torv primed the vent fires with coal dust and old oil. Powder charges were wedged into cracked buttresses along the far hall tunnel, enough to thunder and blind, if not collapse outright. The bait was uglier. Fresh blood from slaughtered goats was smeared along the approach passages and over a trail of broken meat carried down from the upper pens. Karak hated that part, though not for any tender reason. It made the hold look desperate, and desperation had a smell of its own. Hilda smeared the last of it on a stone post and stared at her reddened hands without expression. "Will it come?" one of the miners whispered. Karak listened to the dark. "It's already near." He was right. The first sign was not sound, but movement in the dust below one's support arch, a faint trembling, as if something heavy traveled through broken layers beneath the visible floor. Then came the scrape, close now, circling. Chain links shivered overhead. One minecart creaked on its axle. Somewhere in the dark, beyond the furnace mouths, a patch of scree slumped inward with a dry hiss. "Positions!" Karak breathed. They spread. He took the central gantry with Nessa, the best place to fire and fall back. Brok and Torv crouched by the vent wheel. Hilda and the shield dwarfs held the left haul road with axes ready. The miners waited by their charges, pale-faced, each with a linstock, and the look of men who knew courage and regret were often indistinguishable until later. Then the beast came. It did not erupt cleanly this time. It haunted the edges first. A pale hooked limb unfolded soundlessly from a crack behind a derailed cart and snatched one miner off his feet before he managed more than half a scream. The man slammed against the track, legs kicking, as the claw punched through his back and out through his chest in a spray of shining red. The beast dragged him into the gap between cart and wall so fast that only his boots remained visible for a heartbeat, hammering wildly. Then there was a wet grinding sound, and the boots stopped. "Now!" Karak roared. Crossbows snapped. Torv spun the vent wheel with Brok helping, and ancient furnace breath exploded from side flues in a blast of dry, skin-searing heat. Orange light belched through the chamber. The beast recoiled from it with a shriek of metal on stone, its plates glowing dull in the flare. It burst fully into view at last, longer than any sane creature had a right to be, its body rippling through scree and shattered flagging as though the rubble were a river made for its passage. The heat did not kill it, but it hurt it. The fleshy pits under its jawline, those strange pulsing hollows Karak had barely registered, before drew shut at the blast. The creature thrashed its head away from the furnace breath, more widening in pain. Karak saw then that the pits were sensitive, perhaps organs for tasting air or sensing vibration in the dark. Not eyes, but close enough to a weakness for desperate work. He put a bolt into one. The shot sank deep. Black blood sprayed. The beast convulsed so violently that one forelimb smashed through the gantry railing beside him and tore away a shoulder-high section of iron. Nessa hacked at the limb with her axe, chopping chips from the plate until the third strike found a joint and bit deep. Grey-white slurry burst out, stinking of sour stone and rotten marrow. The thing screamed and surged up onto the gantry. The structure bucked under its weight. Chains rang. Karak stumbled backward as the maw lunged, teeth working in concentric circles. It snapped shut on the railing, where his hip had been a blink earlier, and sheared through iron bars with a shriek of torn metal. Nessa drove her axe into the side of its head and lost the weapon as the beast whipped round, dragging her off her feet. She hit the planks hard, rolled and barely avoided a hooked limb that punched clean through where her spine had been. Below, Hilda and the shield dwarfs met the rear of the creature as it writhed across the gantry approach. One shield dwarf vanished under a lashing tail of plated muscle, struck so hard he cartwheeled through the air and vanished into the chasm without a sound, only the fading clatter of his axe bouncing after him. The other buried both hands' worth of strength into a downswing that split one smaller support limb near the elbow joint. The limb came off in a shower of black blood and twitching gristle. Hilda stepped into the spray and hacked again, and again with a matron's tireless fury, each blow landing with the thick chopping noise of cleaver into butchered joint. "Drop the carts," Brock bellowed. A miner yanked the brake release. 3 old ore wagons screamed down the side rail and slammed into the beast's flank. The first was crushed flat under thrashing limbs. The second tipped and spilled rusted scrap into the chasm. The third struck one of the exposed sensory pits with enough force to burst it in a fountain of dark fluid. The beast recoiled blindly, smashing its own bulk through the gantry supports. Everything started collapsing. Planks snapped. Chains tore free from the roof with cannon-shot cracks. Karak found himself running on a walkway that no longer believed in its own future. Behind him the beast churned through timber and iron, half climbing, half swimming in the ruin. Ahead, the gantry pitched sideways over the chasm. He jumped. His boots hit a hanging chain, slipped, caught. The jolt tore a cry out of him. He swung out over black nothing, while broken beams rained down around him. Below, a pale blur thrashed among falling carts. Nessa clung to another chain 2 yards away, her wounded side smearing blood down the links. Hilda had made the near ledge and was hauling the remaining shield dwarf by one arm while he screamed over a leg bent the wrong way. Brock was still on the far platform, directly above one of the primed charges. The engineer saw the same thing Karak did at the same time. The beast, half buried under wreckage, had turned not toward the fighters, but toward the cracked central support arch behind the furnace mouths. It was hurt, enraged, and seeking stone to swim through. If it burrowed there, under that arch, it would reach the old support caverns beneath the inhabited shelves. And if it died there, the whole structure might come down. "Don't fire," Brock shouted, seeing one miner raise his linstock. The miner hesitated, then lost his nerve. He touched flame to powder. The blast hammered the chamber. A buttress blew apart in a storm of rock shards and fire. The shockwave punched Karak sideways on his chain. Brock was thrown flat. The miner who fired it simply ceased to be whole. His torso opened under flying stone, and he was hurled against the wall in red strips. The beast took the worst of the blast across its flank. 3 plates shattered, meat beneath fountain black. It gave a scream so violent Karak felt it in his ribs, and in that scream the truth became undeniable. The support arch behind it cracked from crown to base. Dust gazered from the fracture. Pebbles rattled from above. Somewhere, far, far up in the living levels of Karak Hollow, the tremor rolled through the stone. Brock dragged himself upright, staring at the spreading crack with horror like a wound. "No more," he rasped. "By all our dead, no more there." The beast, mangled and leaking, thrashed away from the hot vent mouths. It smashed one final path through a field of shattered screed toward the deeper support caverns, leaving smears of black blood over the cracked arch stones. Karak could kill it now, perhaps. One good charge placed ahead of that retreat, one collapsed throat of tunnel, and the thing might finally die in the rubble. But the place where it would die mattered. He saw it then not as a hunter, but as Brock saw it. The old arch, load-bearing and ancient, patched and repatched over generations. The voids beyond, not natural, but shaped by collapse, and the creature's own burrows into a rotten lattice, holding too much weight, the dust drifting from above with each impact, like the first siftings of a grave onto a coffin lid. The beast vanished into the deeper dark, but not far. He could hear it there, thrashing and scraping in pain beneath the support caverns, smashing blindly through stone in its agony. A surviving miner stumbled to the final blasting lever near the mouth of the retreating tunnel. "Say it!" he cried to Karak over the ringing in their ears. "Say the word and I drop the whole throat on the bastard." Karak climbed from the chain to the broken platform, crossbow hanging empty in one hand. He came to stand before the lever, breathing dust and blood and furnace ash. Behind him, Brock struggled to his feet, face grey. Ahead, in the dark below, the beast raged unseen. Wounded enough now that one more collapse might finish it cleanly. From above came another soft patter. Dust, not from this chamber, alone, from the ceilings of homes overhead. Karak stared at the lever, while the mountain breathed around him and the wounded thing thrashed in the dark below. And for the first time since taking the job, he understood that the choice before him was no hunt at all. It was a sentence: monster or home. Chapter 4. Monster or Home. The end of Karak Hollow began with bells. Not war bells. Those had not rung in proper sequence for generations, not since the great axle in the upper signal tower cracked, and the repair was judged too costly for a hold already shaving copper off lamp oil and coffin nails. These were handbells and alarm gongs beaten by terrified arms in corridors never meant to carry panic so high. The sound came ragged and uneven through the upper halls, clang, clang, clang mixed with screaming, with the barked orders of dwarfs trying to force order onto a flood of bodies, with the crash of dropped carts and overturned furniture, as whole families abandoned rooms. They had thought they would die in years from now, not tonight. Karak Voss heard the first of it while still standing by the final blasting lever in the Black Vein district, dust settling through his beard, and the echo of the wounded beast's thrashing still crawling through the deep rock around him. He did not pull the lever. He stared at it, hand hovering over the iron grip blackened by old soot and newer sweat, and imagined what would happen if he did. The tunnel throat below would come down. The beast, bleeding and half-blind, would be crushed or pinned long enough to finish with steel and powder. Its screaming would stop. The hunt would end. But the supports Brock had named the cracked arch, the deadfall voids, the rotten lattice of old burrows and load-bearing rubble would buckle in turn, and somewhere above, perhaps in the market hall, perhaps in the nursery alcoves, perhaps in the sleeping quarter where some family had barricaded the door and decided to pray rather than run, the ceiling would simply cease to be a ceiling, a clean kill, a filthy consequence. Then the tremor came, not from below, from above. A deep, sickly shudder rolled through the stone and rattled every loose chain in the ruined gantries. The dust thickened. Far off, but not nearly far enough, came the muted thunder of something massive, forcing its way into another part of the hold. Brock looked up as if he could see through rock. Nessa swore through blood-stiff lips. Hilda Marsdottir tightened both hands on her axe. "It's moving higher," Karak said. "No," Brock answered. His face had gone the color of old ash. "It's going central." That was worse. The old central workings lay above and west of the deep mining districts, the fossil heart of Karak Hollow where the hold's oldest roads, shrines, storehouses, and hall passages braided together before climbing toward the still inhabited levels. If the beast broke into those workings, it would no longer be raiding outlying pens or side chambers. It would be under the spine of the hold itself. Another tremor answered the first. Then came the bells again, faint and frantic. Brock did not waste breath on argument this time. "Up!" he snapped. "Move, damn you!" They ran. The return through the deeps was a brutal blur of bad air, broken masonry, and pain kept moving only by fear. The survivors of the Black Vein fight were fewer now than Pride or planning had expected. One shield dwarf had gone into the chasm. One miner was meat on the wall. Another limped behind with half a hand wrapped in bloody cloth where falling iron had mashed fingers into pulp. Torv, the furnace keeper, wheezed like a broken bellows, but kept pace from pure stubbornness. Nessa's side wound had burst open again. Blood darkened the hem of her mail coat and left a slick, intermittent spoor on the stone. Hilda, somehow, looked unchanged, drawn tighter, perhaps, older by 10 years in the lantern light, but still hewn from the same inexhaustible malice that grief gave some people instead of mercy. By the time they reached the first upper transfer galleries, Karak Hollow had become a stampede. Families surged toward the upper gates, carrying what they could snatch in minutes. Bundles of clothes, ancestor masks, tools, cooking pots, babies wrapped in blankets, ledgers, icons, barrels of powder, rolled by 3 men at once. Goats shrieked and fought their leads. Children bawled, were cuffed silent, then bawled again. A bent old dwarf woman tried to drag a chest bigger than herself until the crowd simply flowed around her and knocked it over, spilling silvered memorial plates into the dust. Somewhere a priest shouted for calm and was ignored, with the unanimity usually reserved for tax collectors and prophets of inevitable doom. The old central road boomed. A section of floor near the brewer's quarter burst upward in a roar of shattered slab and steam. 3 refugees disappeared into the spray before anyone even understood they were dead. Garrick saw one man hurled against a wall so hard that his spine folded. He slid down, leaving a red ladder of blood and grey matter. Something pale and plated heaved once in the crater below, tearing at the opening with hooked limbs, then vanished sideways through stone before the press of fleeing bodies could close on it with pikes and axes. "It's herding us," Nessa muttered. Garrick looked at the wrecked corridor, at the split in the foundations, at the path of the fleeing crowd, channeled ever harder toward the upper gates and the central stair. "No," he said. "It's following the noise." That was no comfort at all. The elders had lost control of events. That was obvious the moment Garrick pushed into the hall of the third forge and found the soot-black chamber choked not with council, but with refugees, wounded, abandoned gear, and shouted contradictions. Hagen Stonevane stood on the old decision dais, red-faced, and bellowing for the east stair to be sealed. Dori Helga was arguing that the powder stores must be moved before evacuation, or they would be lost. 3 younger warriors screamed at each other over whether to hold the market passage or retreat to the upper gatehouse. No one was listening to anyone else. Brock slammed both fists on the forge table and shouted himself hoarse before enough heads turned. "The central workings are breached," he roared. "Every lower family not already moving goes now. Upper gate only. No detours, no stores, no shrines. Leave the damned furniture and move!" "Cowards talk," Huggins spat. "We stand in the hall of our fathers, then stand there and die under it." Brock barked back. "But stop slowing everyone else." That shut him up, if only because he had not expected to be answered in kind. Garrick climbed the steps to the dais beside Brock and spoke to the room with the blunt force of a man who knew charisma was for liars and merchants, not survival. "The beasts hurt. That's the only mercy we've got. It's moving higher because we drove it there and because the hold is shaking itself to pieces. If we let it range, It'll keep breaching wherever the noise is thickest. We finish this now, or you spend the night listening for which room below your own it chooses next." A few frightened faces turned toward him, a few toward Brock. Hilda came to stand below the dais, with Rurik's axe across her shoulder, red to the haft from old and new work alike. Sometimes one grim figure was better persuasion than 20 speeches. "What do you need?" Brock asked, and the room grew quieter still because dwarfs understood that question when all others failed. Karak looked at the old plans, then at the chamber itself. Charges, crossbows, pistols if anyone still has shot to spare. Men and women hard enough to hold a line in the dark. And every soul not fighting out of the lower central roads before we bring more stone down. "You'll bring it down?" Dory demanded. "We'll bring some of it down," Brock said before Gary could answer. "Or it takes the choice from us." That was the plan, such as it was. Not to kill the beast where it lay, because that lay under too much of Karak Hollow still worth standing on, but to drive it back toward the oldest core tunnel beneath the central shrine district, then use the remaining charges, not as an executioner's hammer, but as a surgeon's rotten knife, collapsing 3 key access ways, sealing the thing back into the deeper dead, with enough rock between it and the living to buy another span of years, perhaps months, perhaps decades, if the mountain proved kinder than it had any right to be. The lower support caverns would still suffer. Part of the old central workings would likely die with them, but the upper gate, market shelf, and main hab levels might stay upright. It was the sort of plan that only looked sensible when laid beside worse ones. They gathered the last fighters Karak Hollow could spare, a knot of gate guards with dented mail and hard eyes, 2 black powder gunners from the ruined West Battery carrying long-barreled pistols, and a single battered blunderbuss. Nessa, white around the mouth but unyielding. Brock, with powder scorched into the lines of his face and a satchel of fuses across his chest. Hilda, with the matron's cleaver axe and her grandson's war axe both. Old Torv with vent charts and a forge hammer for when charts ran out. Even Hagen came in the end, not because he agreed, but because age and pride would not let him hide while others fought under the names he mouthed. The descent into the old central workings felt like marching into the jaw of a mausoleum. These were the oldest halls in Karak Hollow, older even than many of the dead districts below. The road here was broad enough for 6 dwarfs abreast and flanked by ancestor idols carved from the mountain itself. Kings, queens, smiths, priests, each one larger than life, each one cracked by years and tremors. Their eyes watched the passing fighters under soot and shadow. Their noses were blunted. Several had lost fingers or hammers to old falls. It felt less like entering a fortress than walking between the ribs of a corpse too proud to lie down. The air was wet with steam from ruptured pipes and hot with the breath of broken vents. Lamps and torches burned badly in it, their light muddied and haloed. Somewhere ahead, deeper in the old shrine district, stone kept breaking with muffled booms and crawling groans. Dust drifted constantly now, never enough to blind, always enough to remind every living thing there that the roof had begun considering alternatives. They reached the first breach at the Hall of Anvils. Once it had been a ceremonial chamber where newly forged tools were blessed before being carried to the mines. Now its floor was split in 3 places, the flagstones humped and broken by force from below. One of the ancestor statues had toppled onto its face and shattered, leaving a ruin of beard and crown in the dust. Beneath the nearest split lay a dark shaft smelling of blood, hot stone, and that same rank mineral carrion stink Karak would have known by now over perfume and incense alike. He knelt at the edge, touched the stone, and felt a faint vibration. "Close," he said. Then a scream came from farther along the road. The fighters surged toward it. They burst into the processional stair and found carnage. A cluster of refugees had been too slow leaving the lower shrine quarter. Now the broad stair was slick with blood and broken bodies. One dwarf woman lay across 2 steps with her chest peeled open, ribs spread like snapped basket wicker. A young man sat against the wall, holding his own forearm in the other hand, as if still uncertain it had left him. Blood pumped from the stump between his fingers in thick, bright pulses. Above them, where the stair widened before the old ancestor shrine, the beast had half erupted from the right wall and was tearing through the last of the fleeing knot. Torchlight flashed on pale plates, slick with gore. One hooked limb pinned a man to a pillar through the pelvis, while the maw worried his abdomen open in a wet grinding frenzy, stripping loops of gut free in glistening ropes. Another limb snatched a child by the back and flung him into the shrine doors hard enough to burst his skull. The doors bloomed red. "Fire!" Karak shouted. Crossbows snapped. Pistols barked in the stairwell like thunderclaps trapped in iron. The blunderbuss roared and spat a fistful of scrap into the creature's flank, shattering one side plate and flensing a ragged channel of meat beneath. Black blood sheeted down the steps. The beast shrieked and spun, maw opening in obscene rings as it came off the wall. The fight hit like a landslide. It barreled down the processional stair, not on feet, not exactly, but in a convulsing rush of hooked limbs and armored bulk that turned polished centuries-old stone into a slaughter bench. The first gate guard met it with shield raised. One claw punched through wood, iron rim, mail shirt, and sternum all at once. The point burst from his back in a gout of blood and splintered bone. The beast lifted him and smashed him into the next 2 fighters, bowling all 3 down the steps in a tangle of limbs and red froth. Karak fired his crossbow at one of the pulsing sensory pits beneath the jaw. The bolt sank to the feathers. The creature recoiled and slewed sideways. Hilda used that instant, charging up the blood-slick stair with both axes working in brutal alternation, one to hook, one to chop. Her first strike took a smaller limb at the elbow joint and spun it away, trailing black strings. Her second buried deep in a softer seam between plates. The beast whipped round faster than anything that size ought to move. A hooked forelimb ripped across her cuirass, tearing iron scales loose and opening 4 parallel trenches through flesh from shoulder to hip. Blood sprayed the shrine wall in a fan. Hilda did not fall. She screamed through clenched teeth and chopped again, hacking the lodged axe free in a shower of dark fluid and pale gristle. Brock and Torv worked the vents. The old shrine quarter had been built over ceremonial furnace channels once used to keep the central idols warm in winter, a luxury from richer ages. Most had gone cold long ago, not all. Brock slammed a valve open. Torv hammered another wheel until frozen iron screamed and gave. Dry furnace breath blasted from side grills along the stair in a wave of heat and cinders. The beast recoiled violently, maw writhing. Those fleshy pits clamped shut again. Karak saw steam lift from fresh blood on its plates. "Again!" Brock roared. A second vent opened, a third jammed. Torv beat at it with his forge hammer, while sparks jumped and the whole assembly shuddered. Nessa took a claw through the thigh, and still stayed standing long enough to bury her axe into the same wound Hilda had opened. Bone cracked. The beast bucked. Its tail or rear body, thick as a siege beam, lashed sideways and smashed one ancestor idol from the plinth. The Stone King toppled into the melee, crushing one wounded refugee flat and clipping Garrick's shoulder hard enough to spin him down 3 steps. He hit, rolled in blood, came up on one knee to see the creature looming over him. Its maw opened. The inner rings worked hungrily, black and pink and glistening with meat caught between the teeth. He smelled hot blood, his own and others, and the cellar reek of its breath from places too deep beneath the world for sun to matter. One claw pinned his coat to the stair. Another came down toward his face. A pistol boomed almost against his ear. Hagen Stonevein, old fool, had stepped in close and fired point blank into the nearest sensory pit. The ball bursted like a rotten fruit. Black fluid sprayed across both of them. The beast shrieked and turned on the elder with all its fury. Hagen tried to draw his axe and was too slow. The maw latched onto his upper body from shoulder to mid-rib. There was a hideous grinding pop as collarbone, spine, and ribs gave way between the rings. Then the beast ripped back. The elder came apart in halves. One leg remained standing for a ludicrous instant, boot still planted on the stair, before tipping over. The rest of him painted the ancestor doors and everyone nearest them in steaming red. Garrick tore free of the pinning claw, leaving half his coat behind, and drove his spear. He had taken a new one, from a dead guard up into the seam. Brock had marked on the creature's underside, where the armor plates thinned toward the throat. The point sank deep. The beast convulsed, slammed him aside, and burst not down the stair but through the shrine doors themselves. Oak, thick as a man's body, splintered. Bronze hinges tore free. The central ancestor shrine beyond became a charnel chamber in one breath. The room was circular, crowded with old idols, braziers, and prayer niches. Steam hissed from broken floor grates. Torchlight danced on centuries of carved runes. In the center yawned the old core tunnel shaft, a broad ceremonial opening, once covered by a graven stone disc, now cracked wide where tremors had split it. The beast crashed around the chamber edge, smashing idols, scattering hot coals, spraying blood from its wounds. "This is it," Brock shouted over the din. "Drive it to the shaft." They did. The last battle for Karak Hollow became a thing of noise and red ruin. Crossbows barked in torchlight. Pistols flashed and thundered in the enclosed dark. Dwarfs hacked at grasping limbs, while steam billowed from burst pipes, and the floor shook under every impact. The beast came and went among the broken idols in blind rushes, striking wherever sound or movement betrayed flesh. It tore one gunner's face off with a backhand blow that left the man standing headless for a heartbeat, spraying blood from the neck stump before collapsing against a toppled priest idol. It bit Torv through the belly and dragged him screaming across the shrine floor, his guts spilling in a hot shining rope behind him until Hilda hacked the anchoring limb twice and freed him already dying. Nessa took another wound, this one across the scalp, and fought on half-blinded, blood running into her eyes as she hammered axe blows into plate seams with the stubborn mechanical hatred only dwarfs and the damned truly mastered. Brock crawled under a falling idol to reach the charge satchels he had ordered laid around the core tunnel rim. He worked with frantic precision, stuffing powder into old vent cracks and broken sockets in the shrine floor, setting fuses not to collapse the whole chamber, but to shear the approach arches on 3 sides and drop the shaft's upper collar inward. A trap, not a tomb. A plug of masonry, thick enough to buy years if the mountain held. Death delayed instead of dealt. Karak saw what he was doing and understood the shape of the last choice. The beast, half maddened by pain and heat, had retreated to the lip of the core tunnel. It hung there on hooked limbs, body partly in the shaft, maw opening and closing on the air. Blood pumped from a dozen wounds. One whole side of its head was cratered. 2 limbs trailed uselessly. It was hurt badly enough now that a kill was possible. Not easy, not certain, but possible. All Karak had to do was use the large reserve charge Brock had held back for emergencies, jam it into the exposed shaft while the creature clung there, blast the core tunnel to pieces, and bury the monster under enough collapsing rock to pulp whatever remained. Clean enough by the standards of men who hunted in the dark, but Brock's smaller charges were already placed to do something else. Seal, redirect, preserve what they still could. To use the big charge now would not merely kill the beast, it would shatter the ancient lower supports beneath the shrine quarter and send the collapse running outward through the old central road and perhaps beyond it. Karak stood with the heavy powder satchel in both hands, and the whole of Karak Hollow seemed to hold its breath around him. He could hear people still evacuating above, boots hammering distant stairways, children crying, doors slamming, somewhere overhead a cart overturning. He could hear, too, the beast's wet rasp, the grinding of its circular jaws, the scrape of its limbs in the shaft. Monster or home. At the end it was still only that, and no wisdom in the world made the choice less filthy. Hilda staggered to his side, one arm hanging useless, beard and breastplate drenched in blood. "Kill it!" she snarled. Brock, from the far side of the shrine, looked up from the fuses. There was no time left for speeches. His face said what his mouth did not. "If you do, you kill more than that." The beast lunged from the shaft. Karak moved on instinct. He hurled the heavy satchel not into the maw but past it, into the side arch, where an older crack already spread white through the stone. Then he snatched a fuse brand from the floor brazier and rammed flame into Brock's laid train. "Down!" he roared. The shrine vanished in thunder. The first 3 charges blew together, not with the murderous violence of the reserve satchel, but with enough force to rip the side arches apart and throw every living thing in the chamber off its feet. Stone screamed. Idols toppled. The beast convulsed in the blast wave and lost purchase. Karak saw it for one impossible instant, suspended over the shaft amid rain and fire, pale plates, ringed maw, black blood atomized into the torchlight before the collapsing collar of masonry broke inward beneath it. Then the reserve satchel detonated in the side arch, not under the whole shrine, not enough for a full execution, enough to break the chamber's western throat and dump half a mountain of cracked dressed stone, idol fragments, and support rubble across the shaft mouth just as the beast fell. The floor heaved like a kicked shield. A support pillar burst. Another cracked. The central ancestor idol toppled and smashed into the fuse trench. Steam burst from ruptured vents in a blinding white cloud. Hilda disappeared under a rain of carved stone. Nessa was hurled through the shrine doors into the stair beyond, Garak caught one glimpse of Brock, dragged sideways by falling debris, arms over his head. Then the world became dust, impact, and the deep, appalling grinding noise of ancient architecture, deciding how much it could surrender without total betrayal. When Garak woke, he was half buried beneath splintered timber and the broken hand of an ancestor statue. The shrine was gone, or rather, it was no longer a chamber fit for men. It had become a broken bowl of leaning blocks, shattered idols, caved arches and hanging steam. The shaft mouth was buried under a choking mass of rubble that still shifted and popped as lesser stones found their resting places. The western wall had fully collapsed into the central road beyond. Through one jagged opening, Garak could see nothing but a plugged canyon of masonry where the passage used to be. He dragged himself out, coughing mud-thick dust and blood. One knee did not want to bear weight. His left ear heard only ringing. He stumbled through the ruin, calling names, and got answers enough to hurt. Nessa lived, pinned by the legs beneath a split lintel, until he and Brock, yes, Brock lived too, limping and bleeding from scalp and arm, levered it off with a broken spear shaft. Torv did not. They found him crushed beneath a vent wheel, his belly wound spilled wide and packed with stone dust. Hagen was in pieces, no one bothered sorting. One of the gunners crawled from the stair, blind in one eye, and laughing shock laughter, until he saw the body of his brother, and became quiet forever. Hilda took longest to find. She was under the fallen torso of the central ancestor idol, one hand still gripping Rurik's axe. Her chest was crushed nearly flat. Blood bubbled at her lips when Garak knelt beside her. "Did it die?" she whispered. He looked toward the buried shaft. He listened. At first, there was only settling stone. Then, very faintly, from deep under the rubble, a scrape. Not near, not coming now. Buried, entombed. But there. "No," Garak said, "because she had earned truth, if nothing else. Not dead." Her mouth twitched. Whether it was anger or grim amusement, he could not tell. Then the hold still has something to hate. A breath, another, smaller. Good. She died before he could answer. Part of Karak Hollow fell that day. The old shrine quarter was lost entirely. So was the western throat of the central road, the hall of anvils, 2 dead districts beneath it, and a whole shelf of storerooms that collapsed in sympathetic ruin before the mountain finally tired of moving. 23 fighters were never found whole. More refugees died in secondary cave-ins on the lower stairs. A score of others were maimed badly enough that surviving winter would be its own campaign. Yet the upper gate held. The market shelf held. The main hab levels cracked, dust-choked, shaken half senseless still stood. The surviving inhabitants of Karak Hollow kept their home, but only barely, and at a price measured in blood, broken stone, and the widening emptiness behind every familiar road. The elders proclaimed victory because dwarfs had language for survival but little for compromise. Hagen's name went into the grudge books as fallen in defense of the hold, omitting the parts where he had nearly shouted everyone into a stupider death. Brock took command of what rebuilding there could be, marking whole sections forbidden and ordering supports shored with whatever timber and iron remained. Families returned to damaged rooms because there was nowhere else to go. They patched ceilings, reset door frames, washed blood from shrine walls no longer attached to proper shrines. The market reopened within 3 days, because hunger did not respect grief. By the 7th day, children were running again in the safer corridors, though never now without adults shouting after them twice as hard. They called it a victory because the alternative was to name it a postponement. Karak stayed long enough to see the wounded bandaged, the dead stacked, the first new warning runes carved over the blocked central shrine roads. Brock offered him coin from a treasury that could scarcely spare it, and a place among the hold's hired watch if he wished to remain. Karak took the coin. The second offer he did not answer at once. From the upper gate, Karak Hollow looked almost proud in the winter light. Its battered outerworks crouched among black crags, smoke drifting from the vents that still breathed, banners hanging ragged but not yet fallen. A hold still standing, a hold still inhabited. The sort of place men wrote lies about after the fact. He lingered there at dusk, on the day he finally chose to leave, or perhaps only to go as far as the nearest pass, and decide later. The mountain wind smelled of snow and iron. Somewhere behind him, inside the wounded hold, hammers were already sounding again on braces and patches. Dwarfs rebuilt because they did not know how not to. Brock had said the beast was rot inside a bone. Karak thought that was true. He also thought the bone had decided, for now, not to break. For now, far below the upper halls, beneath collapsed shrines and plugged core tunnels, under layers of cracked masonry and old dead districts where no lamp burned any longer, something shifted in the dark. A stone fell, then another, and from the buried black beneath Karak Hollow, so faint that only the mountain truly heard it, came the distant scraping of something still hungry.